Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. Today, we're so lucky to be joined by the fantastic Emily Mortimer to talk all about The Pursuit of Love, which she's the writer, director, and also plays the Bolter in as an actor. And I wanted to dive in by talking about the initial kind of spark in how you wanted to tell this story, because I love the way that you've described how you really saw it almost as a Brexit parallel, particularly when you look at the uncle character and the fact that he's very afraid of anything outside of his bubble. He wants to keep everyone and everything exactly the same and preserve it. And so I was really fascinated in how that led into the way that you then imagined the entire world of this show and a lot of the details thematically and the voice of it.
Yeah, I guess those two things were kind of separate, although connected in a way, because I felt that what was so wonderful about the book was that it's first and foremost just incredibly entertaining, and it's such a treat, and you feel, but it doesn't feel like a guilty pleasure because you feel like you're actually that it's a satire on kind of politics between the wars in England, which there were many parallels between then and now, I feel. Not least this kind of notion of sort of this nationalistic feeling of, just it's best to just keep to yourselves, don't go outside of your comfort zone, don't go outside of your bubble. This kind of growing sort of xenophobia and mistrust of kind of the other, but also the polarization, the kind of massive polarization that was going on, which inevitably led up to on the one hand, a kind of appeasement of Hitler, and then on the other hand, there was the sort of fascist movement in England, and then also which was being counterbalanced by this kind of communist movement, and families like Nancy Mitford's family herself was split down the middle often in their political beliefs, and I feel like that is very relevant to the world we live in now. But what was so great about the way that you're being forced to think about these things in Nancy's novel was that they were, as I said, it was just so funny, and so kind of there was a lack of earnestness, a sort of determined lack of earnestness in the way that she told the story, but because her youth, when she was a young girl, she was living right at that very moment when, the world or families and society was split in that way, where you were kind of deciding what side of the fence you sympathized. And because she was of a certain kind of class, level, that she was mixing with politicians and the establishment of the day, and in many cases her sisters and herself were having affairs or marrying people who were kind of at the heart of British politics and ultimately kind of European politics at the time. So kind of by just sort of by default, her novel happens to act as, and the love life of her central character Linda Radlett happens to act as, a satire on sort of 20th century politics. But as I said, it's done in such a way that it's like blink and you miss it, and it's not polemic at all, and there's nothing browbeaty or judgmental in the least, and most of all, it's just incredibly entertaining, and it feels like a real treat. And so I wanted to somehow combine those qualities in my adaptation and make it feel as delicious and yet also as about something as the novel does.
And that aspect that you were just bringing up about not being judgmental about the characters, and particularly when you look at the character of Linda, is one of the aspects that works so well as we follow them throughout these episodes as well, because you really capture a lot of the motivations and the why. It's, of course, this is what she's pursuing because this is what she's been primed by her family and society for, and she's doing exactly what they told her to do, and now she's being judged for it. So there's a really interesting narrative thread around her as a character without the lens of judgment. And when you look at all the characters, you've really successfully carved them out in that way. And was that something that you were thinking really specifically about even during the script writing process, in always making sure that you stepped back and understood fully and deeply the motivations and the reasons behind things so that we wouldn't judge them?
Definitely. I felt very strongly that that was something in the tone of the novel that I really loved and I really kind of related to and felt the need of. It felt like sort of almost like medicine for the modern, the moment that we find ourselves in, where judgment and kind of easy sort of moralizing is something that is just so, readily available wherever you look. And everybody's got an opinion and everybody's very sure of their opinion. And there's this kind of moral certitude in our culture at the moment that feels to me quite, I don't know, it feels quite sort of potentially quite frightening and certainly not very useful as far as a kind of creating a universe, a creative and imagined world where I don't think there should be that much room for that kind of judgment in artistic offerings, because the whole point of telling stories is trying to understand people, even people who we might consider objectionable or have behaved badly. It's part of what we're trying to do is understand them and anyway, so yeah, I really felt that it was just incredibly important to try to somehow recreate that lack of judgment, to present these characters, warts and all, but to kind of somehow find forgiveness for all of them and understanding and sympathy. And I felt very forgiven reading the novel myself. I felt all the confusion I feel around kind of sex and love and romantic love and trying to be a woman and trying to be a woman with a sort of, ambition, but also, all of it. I felt all the kind of the mess of all of that was seen by Nancy and yeah, forgiven. And so it was definitely a real priority for me that I tried to kind of carry on that tone of sort of moral forgiveness and lack of judgment in the series.
And one of the reasons that it works so well in that way as well is because we're always coming back to the centralized friendship and relationship between Fanny and Linda and the two of them, and the way that we watch the story with Fanny's voiceover, and we really see the way that she's almost quite enamored with Linda and is very much watching her, then carries through into a lot of the ways that you framed Lily James with the camera. So I wanted to ask about the way in which you wanted to tell the story through that very specific perspective.
Yes, I was really interested in, I realized that for quite a lot of the book, and therefore I wanted to make this true for the show, you feel almost like you're watching one girl watch another girl live her life. And that's a kind of an interesting perspective, it felt like to me. Like Linda is at times almost a fetishized character. Like she's kind of this larger than life, full of love and passion and spirit. And she's kind of adored by Fanny to the point of sort of almost infatuation. And yet we're interested, or we should be interested in how that feels for Fanny and what that does to Fanny. And actually the book does touch on that, but it doesn't explore that quite as much as I think I did in my show, because I was really interested in this dynamic where this one quieter, more sensible, more kind of conventional girl adores this other larger than life, kind of just hurling herself at experience and love and sex and, wanting life and love at all costs. And actually that girl, the girl that the quiet girl, the loud girl that the quiet girl is adoring, is very similar to her own mother, who abandoned her. And so she's kind of in love with this girl who reminds her terribly of the mother that abandoned her. And that was a very interesting kind of dynamic to me. And I felt that I wanted to use the camera to somehow, especially in the first episode, set up that kind of, as I said, almost fetishization of Linda, and that feeling of just being kind of your breath being taken away whenever you see her, and that's Fanny's point of view, and that's she's never going to not have that feeling. But as she goes through the two next episodes, she gets more and more questioning of that feeling and kind of confused by it and troubled by it, and tries to shove it down, and then finally at the end kind of just comes to terms with it. But yeah, so I was using the camera a lot to sort of do that, looking at one girl, looking at another girl, and starting with the that thing of Lily running through the kind of undergrowth, being chased by her father on a horse, with the sort of wind in her hair, and this kind of adoring voiceover that's going on from Fanny, the central character.
Because exactly as you were saying with the character of Linda, there are a lot of parallels between her and the Bolter, which is the character that you play, Fanny's mother. How consciously were you thinking about where you wanted to thread in some of the quite obvious details of falling in love, feeling that real sense of hopefulness, and then realizing that maybe not everything's going to work out the way you planned, but also some of the more minute details, which we see as parallels between the two of them?
Yes, I mean, there were actually even more details that didn't quite end up sort of playing, that got left out a little bit. One of them being this I wanted them to basically have the same, like the Bolter and Linda have the same like little necktie, and Lily was incredibly good about her necktie. Like, she knew that this yellow scarf that was her kind of character scarf that she had all the way through from the beginning, when she's lying naked pregnant on the roof, she's got it around her neck, and she's just got that in a fur coat, and in typical Linda style. And then you go back to her as a young girl, and you see it's wrapped around her wrist, and it's everywhere. And I wanted the Bolter to have a similar thing, but I am not such a responsible actress as Lily is, and I played the Bolter, and I kept forgetting to, my necktie, and I'd written this thing in. I was really kind of like psyched about this thing that I discovered, where they were gonna, I'm gonna keep cutting back from Lily and her necktie to the Bolter. Anyway, I kept forgetting my bloody necktie, and sort of other things seemed more important at the time. And then it came to editing, I was like, shit, that was going to be so good. Anyway, yeah, there were lots of little details like that, and I feel that the Bolter is a sort of more, I mean, and what's funny is Linda is absolutely appalled at the fact that she's compared to the Bolter, because the Bolter for Linda is a grotesque, a sort of absurd creature, which in a way you kind of had to become as a woman in those days if you wanted to live outside the accepted conventions, and you wanted to have more than one husband, and which basically, if you wanted to have an interesting life, the only way to do it was to marry more than one guy, because the chances of marrying one guy that was going to keep you entertained for the rest of your life were slim. So you kept having to leave and marry another one in order to have another adventure. But in order to do that, you had to become, you risked society shunning you. And in a way, in order to be able to withstand that, you had to become this kind of absurd version of a kind of femme fatale. Like, so the Bolter wears these turbans and lots of eyeliner and bangles and this kind of armor, a sort of like, fuck you, I am who I am, don't, I'm not going to apologize or explain. And Linda is sort of turned off by that and disgusted by it, and doesn't want to be that person. And so the Bolter is a more extreme version of where Linda might have ended up at some point had she carried on living, or maybe she would have ended up happily ever after with Fabrice, which is what Fanny would prefer to think. But I love the way that the novel treats romantic love, where it's both satirizing it as well as kind of celebrating it, and you never quite know, luckily for the audience, and for Fanny, both Linda and Fabrice die, so we never have to sort of have the terrible letdown of sort of them falling in love with other people, or their romance sort of going sour and it all getting a bit depressing. We can just keep in our minds the possibility that this was a love everlasting, but as the bolter points out at the very end of the series, you know, when Fanny says, I do think Linda was in love with Fabrice, I do think he was the great love of her life, and the bolter goes, well, oh darling, one always thinks that every time. And so the novel and hopefully the show manages to both really celebrate romantic love as well as satirize it. And I feel, as myself anyway, talking personally, that's my relationship to romantic love is like something that I kind of cling on to, as you know, and feel is one of the most important things, and you know, about being alive. And yet at the same time it's kind of absurd and an absurd notion, and you know, who needs it, you know?
But you shape each of Linda's relationships that she has very differently. So by the time we meet Fabrice, we see a different side of her. But throughout the entire time, you also really beautifully tap into the vulnerability within her. And one of the scenes that's really striking with that is when she first gets married, and then you have the camera just looking at all of the guests and then panning over to her and just sitting on her very quietly. And there's so many moments when you really capture a lot of those quiet moments between the dialogue with Lily's performance in that way. Was that something that you had an idea of the essence of that before you went into shooting, or was that something that really came to life once you were on set filming with her and really seeing a lot of the beats of her performance that she was bringing?
Both, I think, is the answer to that. Yeah, I mean, at the end of I knew the end of the first episode was going to finish like that. I think the stage direction was, you know, close up on Linda's face as you know, her husband speechifies, and I wanted it to feel like a kind of prisoner, you know, suddenly realizing that she's escaped from one prison, you know, the life of her childhood and the fortress that was her family childhood home, and she's been so desperate to escape at all costs that she's finally done it. And she didn't realize until that moment that she's just escaped to another prison, basically, and she's stuck for the rest of her life with this guy that she doesn't really know, and is starting to realize is a bit of an arse. And so that was, but but Lily's performance in that moment is just so exquisite, and something so much more than I ever even could have possibly dreamt of happened, which was just like, I mean, it makes me cry every time watching her face in the end of that first episode as the credits roll. It's just like, oh, I don't know. It just so speaks to me about those moments in life. What have I done? And no, and I guess Lily was never not a very emotionally available and ready to kind of give those kind of moments that you a lesser actress wouldn't have been able to provide. So I was almost spoiled for choice. And then it's like you have to kind of know when then the kind of the only sort of task becomes how you don't want to sort of let, you know, there's such a wealth of options, and there's so many amazing kind of moments where you're with her and feeling her pain, but you don't want that to unbalance the kind of emotional journey. And something about Linda is she allows herself to feel things in the moment, but then she kind of rushes on from the feeling and runs away and escapes into another world and another life, so that she doesn't have to feel too much. So it was a question of balancing out those moments with moments where she's hiding her emotions and just running towards more drama and chaos and excitement.
I also wanted to talk a little bit overall about your journey stepping into directing as well, because you've spoken a little bit about how there was a bit of a path to navigate in terms of stepping into that position where you're having to be quite authoritative and quite assertive in running the set in the way that you're making decisions. And so how did you navigate that journey and really figuring out what you wanted your voice to be as a director, and how you really wanted to run the set and make creative decisions with your team in having to kind of like have that slightly more authoritative stance on set as well?
Yeah, that was something I was quite worried about going into it, because I have no natural authority in my real life. My children just laugh at me if I try to get them to sort of make their beds or tidy their rooms, or I sound like David Cameron during the riots. I remember that sort of like, this is absurd, this is terrible behavior, please stop rioting. Basically, I just can't do it. And so I was really very nervous that would be, I'm really quite shy naturally. I'm really not good at I have an uneasy relationship with my own authority and power. And I think people are going to hate me if I ask them to do anything, not just my children, but like anyone. And actually, weirdly, I didn't find it at all difficult. There was a moment at which I had to ask the brilliant set designer, Christina, I had to ask her to cut up her curtains because they weren't letting through enough light. And I was wandering around at a certain point I was going, I think there's not enough light coming into this. It was in the London set in the Cheney Walk, Linda's beautiful Cheney Walk apartment. I mean, everything was just so perfect. She is such a sort of brilliant artist, and so it just felt like kind of sacrilege but there wasn't enough light coming through. I knew, and I had this idea, this room had to be incredibly light and romantic, and like she's finally found her space, and I was just going, I think there's sort of light coming. What do I do? And finally, and everybody was sort of looking at the floor, and finally somebody, I think it was Zach, the DP, was like, I think you're going to have to tell Christina. And I was like, and I said, well, what do I tell her? And he said, I don't know. That she's got to cut them up. She's got to cut the flap off, because there was a flap hanging down with the tassels on it. And so I found myself asking this just, incredibly brilliant, genius, and well-respected and loved and admired designer to cut up her curtains. And it was fine. And I mean, there's something about the fact that, I can't believe I asked her to cut her curtains. She did it immediately. It was just like, okay, fine. But I mean, in real life, could never ask anyone to cut up their curtains. But there was something just about, you're endowed with this authority. Just, there's no question about it. It's not like the whole thing would completely disintegrate if you weren't able, as the person in charge, to make decisions and to ask people to do things and to say, no, yes, I like that, I don't like that. Like, that's really your entire job. And so it's not like you're having to kind of get people to agree to listen to you. They're listening to you. And there's just no room for my normal kind of thing, which is, do you mind? I'm terribly sorry. I don't really know whether this is any good. Like, I just knew that wouldn't fly. And it was very good for me, actually. I think I think it was an amazing experience for me, partly for that reason, that I just felt there was just no time for any faff, and I had to be decisive and I had to be authoritative, and people were totally fine with it. It was just like, of course, like, that's how this thing works. That's how this job works. And I mean, ultimately, I guess what I found really that I loved about the whole experience, but that kind of ties into that, which was unusual and not like the experience that I have as an actor, is that you yourself, or I felt like I myself, was sort of slightly taken out of the equation. Whereas when you're acting, it's all about you somehow. Everything is being filtered through you, your physical being. And this was not that way. And I felt like all I was thinking about at any given moment was how best to tell this story and how to honor this story and to make it the most fun. It could be the most entertaining. It can be the most moving, it could be the most whatever. And it wasn't about me at all. It was just about like empowering all these other people to do the best that they can do, and just always coming back to how you can tell the story. And it felt very exciting that way. And I don't know, all my normal neuroses just sort of weren't there. And then I thought that maybe I would have recovered from being neurotic for the rest of my life, but the minute the job stopped, it all came back. but as it was happening, it was amazing. And you don't have time to think either, so you don't have time to worry about whether someone's going to be upset with you for asking them to cut up their curtains, because you're on to the next thing and the next thing, and then there's someone else asking you about this and this. So the normal way that I am, which is just worrying about everything I've said to everyone and whether or not they're going to hate me, there was just literally no time or room for any of that stuff. And I really loved it.
And with everything that you were saying just now about, you know, how you had to make very quick decisions and move very differently as a director, but also that there wasn't necessarily as much time to think about acting in the same way that you usually would, because when you're directing yourself in scenes, it kind of pulls you into this unique middle ground where you have to pull away from being a director a tiny bit to act, but you also have to pull away from acting a little bit to direct at the same time. So how did that change your relationship with your own performance in the show and having to find that new and unique middle space for yourself?
It was really hard, I have to say. I definitely, I mean, retrospectively, I liked it more than I did at the time. And actually, I feel quite comparatively proud of my performance in The Pursuit of Love, which is, but maybe that's because I literally had the editor in my sort of clutches. Like it was that is an amazing position to be in, editing your own performance. Yeah, I had him hostage, like he had to do what I said. So maybe that if I could get to edit all of my performances, I would be as okay about them as I was about the Bolter. But I hated being the Bolter at the time. I really hated it. And I was really upset that I'd sort of let myself do it, you know, kind of get swept along with the idea that I should play her. And I just kept thinking, this is just too greedy and too weird. And I can't. I mean, it's just too, it's like doing that. Like there's too many it's two completely different skills, completely. And I just felt like I had neither showed up for myself, for my actors, mainly poor Emily Beecham, who was always in the scene with me, or for the crew, or for Zach, the DP, or no. I mean, I was just like a rabbit in the headlights. Like I was too disgusted by myself to watch back the playback afterwards. I couldn't, like, I was just like, there's no way I can watch this and be objective. So I couldn't tell whether I got it, whether I'd got the shot right, nothing. And then in the scene, I was just constantly sort of worrying about where the camera was. And I mean, not even like, it was very, very difficult, and also not made much worse by the fact that I was in these absurd costumes all the time. So I was wearing these kind of ridiculous orange wigs and running from the monitor to the set. And yeah, my grasp on my authority definitely felt a bit shakier on those days. But I think I really liked, I mean, in theory, and then I guess when I now look back on it, I think I did really enjoy playing a part as someone who is, you know, naturally quite aware of my own shame, naturally quite, as I've said, apologetic where I needn't be. I was playing this completely shameless, unapologetic woman, and I think it felt very liberating. Actually, I just didn't have time to appreciate it as it was happening. And I kept trying to fire myself. I literally would talk to the producers every other day, just saying, I can't do this. Please, can I fire Emily Mortimer as the Bolter? I want Dolly to do it. I wish Dolly she would have been brilliant. She should have been the Bolter. But anyway, yeah, but no, now that it's all done, I am happy that I did it, and I do love that character, and I do love kind of somehow there's something so shameless about her that she becomes kind of a heroine of sorts, you know, I think.
Well, I'm so glad that you didn't manage to fire yourself and the producers didn't listen to you. And I really love the way that you've beautifully crafted this through your writing and directing as well. And thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.